group that doesn't know a lot about these things, how are you going to choose somebody? How do you know what you should be asking of them? So these make sense in terms of, you know, if we just let ordinary people try and run their schools, which happened in Discovery, where they had inspections, it became obvious it wasn't working well. They didn't seem to have the capacity to change. The people who'd originally opened it moved out of the way, got some new people in, but it was so complicated, no one knew how to turn it around, that it ended up getting closed. In the case of IES Breckland, actually, once they were told things were not going right, it appears that they've started putting things in place to get better. Now, it looks like that's because there's been more help with managing that contract. So again, what we're learning is if you're going to have contracts, if you're going to have people, you know, looking at schools and being managed on performance, everybody's got to be very aware of what they want from each other and not just think, well, this person can come along and solve it. You're going to have to be very, very involved. Turning then to the successes. At the moment, 10 of those 56 that have been Ofsteded have been rated as outstanding. These are the things that become obvious when you look at that list of people. If you get into the inspection and Ofsted reports, it's not that helpful, but ultimately 2 are alternative provision schools, which is quite interesting, not least because one of the first things I'd said in 2010 was the uniqueness and superiority point was that actually you're probably going to have a really good service if you provide some level of alternative provision, because you're moving into a space which may not have been open before. So 2 of them are alternative, which I found interesting. 4 are in multi-academy trusts. 2 of them are ARC schools. If you haven't heard of ARC before, they're one of the bigger multi-academy trusts. They already have opened other schools. They also do takeover schools. So they're very experienced. And this gets to the nub of the idea that free schools are all the same. People, when they think of free schools, think it's largely anybody who just came up with a zany idea and applied and could open a school. ARC are not zany. They've been going for over 10 years, they've got incredible financial backing, they have a huge team, they're international, they know what they're doing, they're an incredible provider if you look at their results. So the fact that they're in that 10 is quite interesting. How much they reflect a free schools policy is also to be debated. Does their success just show that ARC was able to open 2 more schools that happens to be quite good, and they're already opening schools elsewhere anyway? There is an even split between primary and secondary. At one time, people felt that it might be that secondaries were very difficult to open and do well in. In the US, secondary schools or high schools are incredibly difficult to open as charter schools and do well. Hardly anyone does it. Almost all of the charter schools in the US are elementary schools and middle schools. The fact that people are opening free schools that are secondary schools that are doing well is quite positive, because most people in the US didn't manage it. So if you are in a secondary free school and you've gotten to an outstanding, it's kind of really good, you know, pat on back time on that one and something to learn from. Unfortunately, at the minute, maybe because it's small, or maybe just because there will be no clear pattern, there's no clear pattern emerging of who's going to be successful and who's not. How can we predict from the outset who'll do well? I suspect that won't change. Just like it's very difficult to write down a list of things that any outstanding school... What you'll find is you can write a list of things that an outstanding school does, but I could probably find you a school that reckons it does them, or tried to do them, and it's not outstanding. So even if we can list what these outstanding schools do, so for example, they all have a longer day, they all have, you know, good leaders, I might be able to find you another one of these schools that also has a long day and also has a good leader and yet isn't outstanding. So we're not, I don't think, going to get patterns of what makes success. I do think, and this comes back to the failure thing, we can see what's causing big problems. And I'll actually flick back up to it because I don't think I've put it back in. If I go back to these and reflect on what I think are the genuinely big problems, this external constraints issue is a problem. If you do not have people who you are recruiting in who are good, or you're in an area where it's very difficult to recruit teachers, you being a free school won't solve it. If anything, one of the main pieces of contact I've had this year has been people who've seen my name associated with free schools, have been contacted by someone I headhunted by a free school, and has then written to me and said, do you think I should take a job with this free school? What if it doesn't open? How risky is it for my career? How likely is it to go wrong? No one has ever written to me before and gone, oh, is it a risk for me to move to this maintained school? So, you know, it isn't going to be easy necessarily for you to hire the good people that you think. The second thing on community, which hasn't come up in any of the spectacular failures, but has become apparent in conversations with people, is it's very difficult in the first year to get parents to agree to come to your school. And one of the reasons for this is they will have children in other schools. So first cohorts tend to be eldest or only children. Now that gives you also quite an advantage, because eldest and only children actually academically tend to do slightly better. So what you'll tend to find is that a first cohort will have a bump effect, especially if you then go on to become very successful. You can end up with a third cohort that is all siblings, so they'll all be middle or youngest children, and then that can actually prove a bit of a problem with your results at a later point. So if you're opening a free school, try and figure out some ways that you can get more of a mix, otherwise you end up with this really weird sibling effect. Time is already being resolved because most of the time more time is being given. Core group is becoming more apparent. Greenwich Free School are one of the free schools that were considered sort of excellent. They've had requires improvement, which was a bit of a shock to people. It's interesting speaking with them at the moment because a lot of them knew each other when they opened, and they did lots of the things that really help with your leaders. They should all get to know each other, they should be able to not have conflict, they should know where authority lies, and they've done that really quite well. But they're struggling to add people in now because they're so close-knit, because they're so small, because they became quite kind of famous and well-known within their own circles. It's then very difficult to go out and recruit people who feel like they're outside of that. So just be a little bit aware that as you go forwards, you know, new schools become old schools, and these things will start to catch up with you. I'm going to check on time, so I know we started a little bit late. We're at 12:38, and I think we're due. I've got someone up there who came in. I think we're due to finish in another 5 minutes. What I was going to do next is I will reveal what I think are my 3 predictions for the future in terms of what I think might be, if not the failures, certainly the pathways or where I think things might go next. But I'm interested to know, on the back of what you've heard, on the back of what you've been thinking, what you might think will happen next. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to give sort of 2 minutes for you to look back over what you've just written or heard, and just have a think for a few minutes about what you think will happen next. Maybe get that in your mind, and then when I reveal my predictions, you can see if they are the same as yours. So I'll stop everyone again in 2 minutes after you've had a bit of a think and a chat, if you've got a friend with you.
How much reliance do you pay to Ofsted's judgment? Do the outstanding schools deserve outstanding? Did Greenwich Free School
Yeah, until you've got a set of results, that's all you've got, really, that's independent. Obviously I've been a business school, and I can say what I saw on the data, I'm not looking at I'm not looking at that data. And so really, until you have data, all you can have is the assumption that someone who's independent, who's gone and had looked at it, is going to tell you the truth. And you at least have there what is written down, you just need to data and prove the numbers. So I'm kind of like, I think I might be off the right answer, but what would you do?
I don't know. It's just that I've seen some schools that have got outstanding, not the same circumstances, and some schools have got obviously up there satisfactory. I was more than that.
And that's because I find that the ethos. I think the ethos is big. And I think that's one of the things I did do was look at prospectuses, and it was interesting at the time that art prospectus, I have to say, was the one that had the most clarity in it. We looked at verbs and nouns and how they described things, and they did have by far and away the best prospectus. And it was interesting that they then started coming out as the ones that did the best. Yeah, there will be also like PIUs and things like that, provisional people referral units.
Oh, so it would be more like standard.
No. That is, I believe, 2 minutes. 2 minutes of time for the predictions and the Mystic Megs monster. So a couple of good questions that were just raised here at the time, and I'll just address those now while I have time. One is about how reliable are Ofsted? Should we use Ofsted judgments? Many people will have either read Ofsteds which they didn't agree with, or have had ones that they didn't agree with. At the moment it's quite difficult because there isn't any data available for most of the schools. All we have in terms of the independent evaluations are largely Ofsted. That doesn't mean that I think that parents necessarily will choose on the basis of those. So the point that was raised here is, it might be an outstanding school, but it wouldn't be where I'd want to send my child. And I can completely understand that. If it's not the ethos and if it's not what you're looking for your child, I can understand why you wouldn't send them there. And at the same time, I can understand, even if it's a requires improvement school, but it seems like exactly what you want, it's delivering the curriculum you want, then yeah, sure, send your child there. I suppose from my perspective, I've always felt that Ofsted at least are independent and are giving you a set of criteria against which we can look at everybody in the same way. So you might not necessarily think that it says that it's going to be the school for your child. You might not think it means it's a great school, but it is a way of judging where they are relative to each other on a set of things. The second question was around alternative provision. My understanding is that they're the pre-pupil referral units or types of provision which are doing more vocational work and tend to have students that have been sent there specifically for those reasons, rather than alternative in the sense of religion or ethos or something like that. So, cause for predictions. I'd be interested to know how many of you got the same ones as me. This, I think, is where we're going, which is that multi-academy trusts will become the main free school operators. Certainly, that has become the pattern in applications and who is getting through. It actually follows what you see in lots of other parts of government, where we go, well, we're going to open up this provision, and there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of people, and it's going to be great, it's going to be all this innovation, and then about 4 providers, as ever, end up with all of the expertise, the time, the money, the investments, the capacity, the people. One of the great things I said before about ARC is they have the people, the money, the capacity. And so you tend towards them, A, because they're quite safe. We know that they're doing a good job, so why wouldn't we select them? But the better job they do, the more people they get. And we end up back, really, with an oligopoly that you just have to manage. That may be a good thing or a bad thing. I maybe rail privatisation is one of its few kind of people who stick up for it, and I don't think it's a problem that there are only a small amount of operators in that, although more come in and out all of the time. That's the main question. Can you get people coming in and out and challenging that? It does mean that this idea of the sort of small parent group becomes more difficult, but I don't think it will go away. It's just going to be a case of balancing that out. Again, in the US, we've seen exactly the same thing, where you tend to have big operators who do well being the main competition, but you do keep these pockets of smaller groups of people who rise up and occasionally do really good things. This is something from the US that I'm aware of. It happened and it blindsided lots of US states, so be aware of it. I think we're going to see increasing numbers of people who are going to apply to open virtual schools. Philadelphia in particular got caught out with this because it didn't have any regulations or rules for how they would deal with that situation. So people who are suggesting either a school where students stay at home but deal with their learning online, or a school where students come in for part of the day but most of the learning is online. And one of the things that Philadelphia didn't think about was, well, if you don't have a school building and the students are at home, how do we monitor how many of them there are? How do we monitor their attendance? Do we have to pay the school the same amount? Because the operator said, well, your contract say you'll pay us $5,000, whatever. So the fact that we don't have a building, I would still like my $5,000, please. And then they found loads of fraud and problems and had a terrible time of it. I am already aware of, there are some US operators, virtual charter school operators, who are already working in collaboration in schools as CEOs of trusts in this country already, who want to move into this space. So this is not, it's not that people aren't, they are ready. They are ready to do this. It's just whether or not we as a group of educators are aware of what's going on. Virtual charter schools can also be brilliant. Don't let me make out like it's all just fraud, especially for children that have needs about being homeschooled, school refusers, children who move around a lot, children with medical conditions which mean they can't go to school. They can be excellent. It's just a case of trying to work out whether they're going to come about. The third thing, if I was going to stake my claim on where I think this will go next, is that I think free schools might start, well, in fact, they are already being offered as part of takeover bundles. So essentially, the bit in italics I'll get to in a second, but essentially already there are trusts that are being told that unless they take over a certain number of schools, they will not be able to open their own ones. So what you could do is use free schools as leverage. You want your own new school, that's great, but you're going to have to help us with 2 or 3 other failing schools. And so free school groups become less about opening new schools and become more about mergers and acquisitions. If I was in favour of for-profit education, so I wanted schools to be run for profit, I would use that as my leverage. Okay, there are these 2 difficult schools, someone's got to take them over. I will only take them over if I can make X thousands of pounds. And there's going to come a point, I think, where there are going to be schools potentially that may have to close, or a deal is going to have to be struck. Well, you know, all right, well, we want you to take over. There's these 3 really awesome schools that you know, they're in financial trouble, but we know they're great schools, so we'll wipe off their debts and we'll give you these schools, but you've got to take over this difficult one, and then we'll allow you to open a free school and bundle them together. To me, it actually makes sense that you would do that. It's just whether or not people are going to push the for-profit line, would go for the for-profit line, whether it's a smart thing for anybody to do. So if I was going to put my predictions forward and say the things to watch out for, this is what I would go with. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will happen, but some of it will come down to how smart we are to pay attention to it. And on that, I think I've probably already run over by 4 minutes. I'm not sure whether it was 1:45 or 10 to after what had happened. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take maybe 2 now, and then we can go to lunch. Yep.
How do you offset a virtual school?
Well, that was one of the things that actually caught out lots of people, is how do you offset it, because there's no specific building, and they actually couldn't even audit them. That was the problem. You actually can't go and count